Picture a dusty frontier town at high noon, where the sun bakes the cracked earth and fate is sold to the highest bidder. There among the wagons and the wide-eyed onlookers, a widowed rancher, stoic and haunted by his past, raises his hand to purchase a chance at hope. He doesn't know the woman's name, nor her story, but something compels him to act. In a single moment, two battered souls collide, and destiny is set on a collision course with redemption. This is a story of grit, heartbreak, and the fierce courage it takes to turn a lonely house into a home. Henry McCullen was known across the Oklahoma Territory for his unyielding work ethic, a man who once wrestled raging steers and outsmarted wily coyotes to protect what he cherished. But the day he lost his wife, Eleanor, was the day a piece of his soul turned to ash. The wide sky above his ranch, which had once filled him with boundless possibility, now felt heavy and bruised with sorrow. It had been 18 months since cancer claimed Eleanor. 18 months of lonely suppers in a quiet house, the empty chair at the head of the table, a persistent reminder of what he could never replace. Beneath his tall frame and slate-grey eyes lay a shattered heart that refused to mend. He clung to routine checking fence lines at dawn, mending the barn roof by noon, corralling the cattle by dusk. It was the only way he knew to keep from unraveling. The ranch named Sunset Bluff sprawled out over hundreds of acres. The land was a legacy passed down through 3 generations of McCullens. Henry had spent his boyhood riding horses across the rolling hills, and despite his heartbreak, he wasn't about to let it crumble on his watch. Bills had piled high after Eleanor's medical expenses, forcing him to adapt and innovate. But no matter how busy he kept, loneliness found a way to seep back into his bones when night fell. On a brisk morning in early autumn, Henry hitched his wagon and headed to the nearby town of Lone Pine. His foreman, a grizzled ex-cavalryman named Clive Haywood, had suggested selling off a few breeding horses at the monthly livestock auction. It was an idea Henry initially resisted because those horses had sentimental value. They had been part of Eleanor's cherished stable. But times were tough, and the ranch needed capital. As he passed through miles of prairie, Henry felt a certain weight pressing on his chest. This was more than just another trip for supplies. Something about this particular morning felt different, like the wind carried an omen. The wide-open space dotted with yucca plants and sagebrush reminded him of the early years with Eleanor, riding side by side, dreaming of children they never got to have. Reaching Lone Pine. Around midday, Henry found the town buzzing with its usual chaos. Shopkeepers yelled out bargains, traveling salesmen peddled miracle elixirs, and wagons kicked up clouds of dust that turned the air a dull beige. Over by the saloon, men in broad-brimmed hats and dusty boots shared tall tales while sipping cheap whiskey. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang through the streets. At the auction yard, he found a small crowd gathered around a makeshift stage. He expected to see sheep and horses, maybe some broken farm equipment. But what he witnessed next stunned him. A man in a threadbare suit was announcing the auction of something no one expected. Lot number 9, a woman. An indenture for legal guardianship and employ. The chatter among the townsfolk was uneasy. This wasn't common practice, even in the rough-and-tumble West. But times of desperation birthed desperate deal. Henry's eyes wandered to the stage where a thin, trembling figure stood. She wore a dress covered in the dust of a hard journey, her eyes flickering with both fear and a faint spark of defiance. Henry felt his pulse hammer. He was no stranger to tragedy, but seeing a woman likely on her own, possibly cheated by unscrupulous folks, shaken in front of an eager crowd, stirred a mix of pity and anger within him. He caught Clive's eye. The old foreman shook his head in warning. This wasn't their business. They had come to sell horses, not buy trouble. But Henry's conscience wouldn't let him stand idly by. Without a plan or a second thought, Henry tipped his hat back and listened as the bidding began. The auctioneer's voice rose above the chatter, and Henry found himself raising his hand in a moment that would forever change his life. Charlotte Dawson had seen her share of hardships, but nothing compared to the humiliation of standing before strangers who sized her up like livestock. Born in an upstate Missouri farmhouse, she'd lost her parents to a fever at a young age. Raised by relatives who saw her as nothing more than an unpaid servant, Charlotte spent her adolescence yearning for a life she could call her own. At 19, determined to find work in a bigger city, she boarded a wagon train heading southwest. Bad luck dogged her trail. The so-called benefactor, who lured her with promises of a respectable job in the Arizona Territory, turned out to be a con artist. He disappeared in the dead of night, leaving her stranded in Lone Pine with no money, no connections, and no clue what to do next. That was how she ended up on this makeshift stage, under the watchful eye of a court clerk who insisted her indenture was the only way to settle her traveling debts. A swirl of repulsion and sheer terror churned in her stomach as she glimpsed the sea of faces below her. Some men looked at her with lecherous eyes. Others just shook their heads in pity. Charlotte's heart pounded. Perhaps this was fate punishing her for daring to dream of a better life. A red-faced man in a stained vest started the bidding at $5. Another voice offered $6. As the numbers climbed, Charlotte's sense of self-worth plummeted. Then came a voice that rose above the murmurs. $20. The crowd hushed. It wasn't the amount that shocked them. It was the tone, steady, almost reluctant. Charlotte looked toward the source. Standing tall with broad shoulders, his face lined by sorrow or worry, was a man who seemed out of place among the onlookers gawking at her. With calloused hands and a certain gravity in his gaze, he wore his loneliness like a second coat. The auctioneer, taken aback by the sudden jump, wasted no time. "We have $20. Do I hear 25? Silence followed, but for a nervous cough here or there. Finally, the gavel slammed down. Sold to Mr. Henry McCullen. Charlotte's legs nearly gave way. Was she grateful or terrified? She didn't know. All she knew was that the man who had just purchased her seemed less like a predator and more like someone acting on impulse. A hush fell over the crowd, as if everyone collectively realized they had just witnessed a transaction that was both morally questionable and undoubtedly life-altering. With shaky steps, Charlotte was escorted off the stage. She clutched the small bundle of personal items. She had managed to keep a ribbon from her mother, a worn Bible from her father. The court clerk, looking somewhat relieved that this ordeal was over, quickly completed the necessary papers. Technically, Henry McCullen now held her indenture contract, meaning she was legally bound to work off her debt under his roof. When Charlotte mustered the courage to look up at Henry, her gaze met a pair of solemn grey eyes. Instead of pity or triumph, she found uncertainty and an odd sort of compassion. He tipped his hat, introduced himself in a voice tinged with regret, and motioned toward his wagon. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he mumbled. "Let's settle your affairs and get you a place to rest." Charlotte was speechless. All she could do was nod. Around them, bystanders quickly lost interest and resumed bidding on livestock. The world moved on, but for Charlotte Dawson and Henry McCullen, life had taken a sharp, irreversible turn. Clutching her meager belongings, Charlotte followed Henry through the dusty street, tears threatening to spill as the enormity of her predicament sank in. Freedom, if one could call it that, came at a price, and she had no idea what that price would be. Henry's wagon swayed gently as it traveled over the rough path leading away from Lone Pine, the late afternoon sun painting the horizon in shades of gold and pink. Charlotte sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her heart still racing from the day's events. Every jolt of the wagon threatened to unsettle her further. She glanced sideways at Henry, whose stern profile was softened only by the occasional flicker of concern in his eyes. They stopped briefly at a general store on the edge of town to pick up supplies. Word traveled fast in small settlements, and the store's proprietor, Martha Leland, offered Charlotte a polite smile, tinged with curiosity. "Saw you up at the auction yard," Martha said in a hushed tone, not wanting to pry too obviously. Charlotte managed a small, polite nod. Martha wrapped up some salt pork flour and coffee beans, then added a small bag of sugar, perhaps a silent gesture of kindness. Charlotte thanked her in a near whisper, though she wasn't sure if it was gratitude or embarrassment that colored her cheeks. The remaining journey to Sunset Bluff took a couple of hours. By the time they arrived, dusk was giving way to twilight. The ranch spread out before them, a mix of grazing land, horse pens, and a sturdy farmhouse that stood on a slight rise. Flickers of lantern light through the windows hinted at life within. Henry guided the wagon toward a barn where Clive Haywood waited. Arms folded, his expression unreadable. He gave Charlotte a brief nod, then turned to Henry. "Everything go all right in town?" Clive asked, his tone revealing guarded concern. Henry exhaled. "Got more than we bargained for." He helped Charlotte down from the wagon, then motioned for her to follow him toward the house. Stepping inside, Charlotte noticed the place was neat, though worn by time and hard living. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, and the scent of aged cedar lingered. Family portraits hung on the walls, fading images of McCullen ancestors, and one of a beautiful woman with gentle features and kind eyes. Charlotte felt an ache in her chest. That woman must be Eleanor. The sadness in Henry's expression whenever his gaze brushed the portrait was unmistakable. Henry cleared his throat. "You can take the room at the end of the hall on the left. It was supposed to be for family, but there's plenty of space." He paused, struggling for the right words. "We'll figure out the work arrangements in the morning." Charlotte nodded, clutching her bundle of belongings. She expected to be treated as a servant, or worse, but Henry's polite deference unsettled her more. Why was he so reluctant, almost apologetic about the situation? She murmured a soft, "Thank you," and disappeared down the hall. The room was small but comfortable. A four-poster bed took up most of the space, and the window overlooked the barn. As Charlotte set her things on the small dresser, she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The events of the day being sold, traveling with a stranger arriving at this lonely homestead, surged up in a wave of exhaustion and uncertainty. She buried her face in her hands, letting out silent sobs. That night, Henry busied himself in the main room, nursing a cup of black coffee. The house was too quiet for his taste, as if it were holding its breath. Memories of Eleanor seeped through the cracks of his mental armor. He had sworn to never let another person into that sacred emotional space. Yet here was Charlotte Dawson, a woman who needed shelter. And though he acted on impulse at the auction, part of him wondered if this was something bigger than chance, perhaps a nudge from the ghost of his beloved. Before heading to his own room, Henry paused outside Charlotte's door. He listened for any sound that might indicate distress. Hearing only silence, he whispered a tired good night to no one in particular, then turned away. Exhaustion overcame them both, and the household settled into a restless sleep as two wounded souls began a strange, involuntary journey toward healing, though neither yet knew it. The first few days at Sunset Bluff were awkward at best. Charlotte rose with the dawn, determined to prove her worth. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors, dusting shelves and tidying corners that hadn't seen a broom in months. Henry, accustomed to doing chores himself, found her diligence unsettling, like a visitor rearranging a shrine. He couldn't complain, though. The house had been in a state of quiet neglect since Eleanor's passing. Seeing it swept and polished brought a pang of nostalgia, as if memories of Eleanor were being stirred up from where they lay sleeping. Charlotte tried to maintain a respectful distance. She was, after all, under a contract that essentially made her a bond servant. But Henry refused to give explicit orders. When she asked him how to fulfill her obligations, he'd scratch the back of his neck and mutter, "Don't feel right giving you a list of chores. Just do whatever you think needs doing." Working in the kitchen one morning, she found a small tin of Eleanor's favorite tea. The label was faded, but the faint lavender scent brought memories she could only guess belonged to Henry and his late wife. She ran her fingers over the tin, thoughtfully imagining a time when the house was filled with the warmth of shared laughter. The stables became another point of refuge. Charlotte discovered she had a knack for soothing nervous horses, a talent she'd developed in her uncle's barn back in Missouri. One mare Rosie took to Charlotte, immediately nuzzling her for treats whenever she approached. It was the first real bond Charlotte formed since arriving on the ranch, and Rosie's gentle nickers felt like a friend's reassurance. "You're safe here." Word eventually spread about the indentured woman residing at Sunset Bluff. Some folks in Lone Pine, like Martha Leland, offered compassion. Others fueled rumors whispering about Henry's purchase with gossipy disdain. Clive Haywood, weathered from years of soldiering, grunted at such talk, calling it rubbish. He'd served in the cavalry under Colonel Benjamin Grierson and had seen the best and worst of humanity. "People gossip when they ain't got nothing better to do," he told Charlotte one afternoon while adjusting a saddle. "Don't pay 'em no mind." Despite his gruff exterior, Clive became an unlikely ally. He taught Charlotte how to mend fences and drive a wagon team. In return, she mended his shirts and cooked hearty stews that reminded him of his mother's kitchen in Ohio. Over shared meals, they swapped stories, forging a cautious camaraderie. Henry mostly kept to himself, tending to the cattle and overseeing ranch business. He interacted with Charlotte, politely but maintained a safe emotional distance. An underlying tension simmered between them, not of anger, but of unspoken longing and guilt. Two individuals carrying past traumas they neither understood nor were ready to share. Late one evening, Charlotte ventured outside for fresh air. The moon was high, casting a silvery glow over the ranch. To her surprise, she found Henry standing by a horse pen, gazing out across the rolling fields. The quiet intimacy of the moment was palpable. Even the crickets seemed to hush. "Couldn't sleep?" Charlotte asked softly. Henry shook his head. "Too much on my mind." A pause. "You?" She nodded, hugging her shawl around her shoulders. "Everything is different. I'm trying to find my place." She looked at Henry, uncertain if he wanted to hear more. He exhaled the weight of unspoken burdens evident in his eyes. "I know this arrangement isn't what you wanted." He began, struggling to find the right words. I couldn't leave you there in that auction. Didn't sit right with me." Charlotte's gaze dropped to the ground. "I don't blame you. I'm grateful even if it means being indentured. It's better than the alternative." A gentle breeze drifted past them, carrying the scent of hay and wild sage. In that fleeting moment, they shared a fragile understanding. Two wounded souls bound by circumstance, each yearning for solace, but unsure how to find it. Their brief moment was interrupted by a distant thunderclap. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, reflecting nature's own sense of foreboding. They both knew that storms in the Oklahoma Territory could be fierce, sudden, and destructive. As they retreated to the house, neither realized just how soon fate would test them with trials that would force them to confront not only their own haunted pasts, but also the unspoken connection growing between them. The storm arrived with a furious roar, lightning splitting the sky in jagged forks. Rain pummeled the rooftops, drenching the parched earth in an onslaught of water. Henry and Clive dashed to secure the stables and herd the cattle into safer enclosures. Charlotte, soaked to the bone, ran from the house to the barn, guiding Rosie and the other horses to calm them amid the booming thunder. In the flicker of lightning, Charlotte saw Henry's face streaked with both rain and worry. "We can't let the water break the fences," he shouted over the howling wind. "If the cattle get loose, we'll lose everything." They worked relentlessly, each clap of thunder, rattling them, each gust of wind threatening to upend their efforts. Mud sucked at their boots, and the swirling darkness of the night made the task perilous. By the time the worst of the storm passed, it was well past midnight. Exhausted, they trudged back to the house. Charlotte collapsed onto a chair, muscles trembling from cold and exertion. Henry lit a lantern, his brow creased in concern. "You should change out of those wet clothes," he said, noticing Charlotte's shivering. His voice, though stern, held a gentle undertone. She nodded and dragged herself to her room. Come morning, the storm clouds dissipated, revealing a battered ranch. Fences were knocked loose, and portions of the nearby creek overflowed, flooding the low-lying fields. Clive and Henry surveyed the damage, wearing grim expressions. The cost of repairs would be steep, and the lost grazing land would hurt the ranch's already precarious finances. Charlotte, determined to help, donned her work boots and set about salvaging what she could. As she collected scattered tools and debris, she overheard Henry and Clive talking in urgent tones near the barn. "Thomas G. Beric has been eyeing this land for a while," Clive warned. Beric was a notorious land baron, known for snapping up struggling properties. If he hears we're in trouble, he might swoop in with an offer we can't refuse. Henry's face hardened. "Over my dead body. This ranch isn't for sale. I'll find a way to keep it afloat." Clive shrugged. "Just be careful. Berwick's got his fingers in the pockets of a lot of local officials. He's used to getting what he wants." Charlotte felt an unsteady lurch in her stomach. She hadn't realized just how precarious Henry's financial situation was. Memories of being used and discarded haunted her. She knew too well the cruelty of powerful men like Beric. Determined not to be a burden, she resolved to do more than just housework. She approached Henry later in the day, stepping outside her comfort zone. "I can help with the books if you'd like. I learned some accounting from my uncle." Henry looked at her surprised. "That'd be, actually, quite helpful." He led her to a small office adjacent to the main room. Piles of unpaid bills, receipts, and account ledgers cluttered the desk. Charlotte rolled up her sleeves and got to work sorting through the mess. Henry leaned against the doorframe, relief and embarrassment mingling in his eyes. "Eleanor used to do all this. I never realized how much work it was until she was gone." Charlotte offered a gentle smile. "It's all right. I'll do what I can." That evening, after reorganizing the books and calculating potential revenue streams, Charlotte presented Henry with a plan. You can sell some of the older stock and invest in new dairy cows," she explained, her brow knitted with concentration. "Cattle prices are higher in the neighboring counties. If we can swing transport costs, we can turn a profit." Henry listened intently, occasionally asking questions. He was impressed by Charlotte's tenacity and intelligence. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt a flicker of something like hope. "You've thought this through," he said, his tone more admiring than he intended. "Thank you." As the days passed, they put the plan into action. Charlotte wrote letters to potential buyers in nearby territories, offering a fair deal on the surplus livestock. Clive scouted markets for affordable dairy cows. Henry prepared to approach the local banker for a small loan. A collective sense of purpose began to bind them together, an unspoken agreement that they were a team now. Yet whispers of Thomas G. Beric's looming presence refused to fade. Rumor had it that Beric had also set his sights on controlling the railroad expansions, which would run perilously close to Sunset Bluff. When he arrived in Lone Pine one afternoon, in a fancy carriage, sporting a slick grin and a polished cane, everyone knew trouble had come calling. And with the ranch still recovering from storm damage, Henry would soon face a threat more dangerous than the fury of any thunderstorm. It didn't take long for Thomas G. Beric to make his move. Clad in a tailored suit, his hair neatly combed, he arrived at Sunset Bluff with the air of a man who believed he owned the place. Henry stood on the porch, arms crossed over his chest, watching the carriage kick up a cloud of dust before coming to a halt. Charlotte peeked from the window, heart pounding. She had heard the stories Beric was known for employing underhanded tactics and buying off anyone who stood in his way. Beric stepped out and removed his hat. His smile was all politeness, but there was a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Mr. McCullen." "Good day," he said, approaching the porch. "Lovely ranch you have here." Henry nodded curtly. "What brings you out this way?" "Beric." Beric let out a theatrical sigh. "I heard about the storm damage." "Such a shame. You've always been a proud landowner. I thought I'd offer my assistance, perhaps lighten your load." "Appreciate the concern," Henry replied evenly. "But we're getting by just fine." Beric took a moment to glance around, noting the half-repaired fences and the exhausted look on Clive's face as he walked by with a coil of rope. "Well, it appears you're working hard, but sometimes hard work just isn't enough. I could make you a very handsome offer for Sunset Bluff. Think of it as a favor." Henry stiffened, a muscle in his jaw twitching. "Sunset Bluff isn't for sale." Beric cocked an eyebrow. "Think it over. My offer would let you walk away with pockets full of cash. After all, this place must hold painful memories." His gaze flickered toward the house where he spotted Charlotte, observing him from behind a curtain. A curious smile tugged at his lips. "I see you have some new help. Possibly a caretaker." Henry's stare turned icy, but he said nothing. Beric cleared his throat, as if satisfied with stirring up tension. "I'll be staying in Lone Pine for a few weeks. Should you change your mind, you know where to find me." He tapped his cane on the porch step, turned and sauntered back to his carriage. The smug wave he gave before leaving set Henry's teeth on edge. Once Beric was gone, Charlotte stepped out onto the porch, anxious. "What will you do?" she asked, searching Henry's face for some sign of reassurance. His features were grim. "Exactly what I said, not selling. I'll find a way to keep Sunset Bluff afloat." He paused, noticing the worry etched on Charlotte's brow. "We'll be all right," he added softly. but he wasn't entirely sure. That night, Henry pored over the ledgers Charlotte had organized, looking for any financial wiggle room. He found some hope in the pending sale of older livestock, but it wouldn't cover everything, especially not the loan he'd need for the new dairy cows. The orchard out back also required replanting after a long drought. Henry realized he was betting on multiple small victories to keep the ranch afloat, and there was little margin for error. Charlotte, meanwhile, tried to steady her own nerves by staying busy. She baked bread, mended clothes, and even ventured into a section of the property that had once been a small garden. Overgrown weeds choked the rows where vegetables once thrived. Determined, she spent hours uprooting them, her hair clinging to her damp forehead. By sunset, she'd cleared a small patch her knees caked in dirt. It was a small victory, but it felt meaningful. Looking out at the horizon, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that a storm of a different sort was brewing, one that might threaten more than the ranch's finances. Beric's parting look had sparked a chill within her. Men like him were dangerous because they wore civility like a cloak masking ruthless ambition. She had seen such men in her travels, and she knew how cruel they could be when denied. At dinner, Henry picked at his meal, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. "Tomorrow, I'm riding into Lone Pine to talk to the banker. Clive will stay here with you. If all goes well, we'll secure a loan for some new stock. Then we can push forward with the dairy plan." Charlotte nodded. "I can keep working on the garden. The more food we can produce ourselves, the less we'll spend on provisions." He offered a faint smile. "Thank you," he said, and there was genuine gratitude in his voice. Gratitude not just for her labor, but for her presence, though he couldn't quite bring himself to say it outright. That night, the wind whispered around the corners of the house, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the hoot of an owl. In her room, Charlotte found herself unable to sleep, haunted by memories of the auction and by the uncertainties that lay ahead. For Henry, it was Eleanor's face that hovered in the corners of his mind, along with the image of Thomas G. Beric smirking at his porch. A quiet dread settled over Sunset Bluff, an uneasy calm after the literal and figurative storms they'd already weathered. Both Henry and Charlotte sensed that something was coming, something that would test their fragile partnership and perhaps force them to confront the ghosts that still lingered in every room of that old ranch house. Early the next morning, Henry saddled up and rode off to Lone Pine. Charlotte and Clive split their tasks for the day. He inspected the far fences while she tended the garden and house. By mid-afternoon, she decided to clean out a small storage shed that sat behind the barn. The old structure had belonged to Henry's father, who used it to store tools and miscellaneous items. Pushing open the squeaky door, Charlotte was greeted by dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight. Old saddles hung on rusted hooks, and boxes were stacked haphazardly in corners. She set to work pulling out crates to sweep the floor. It was there, behind a pile of broken bridle bits, that she stumbled upon a trunk wrapped in a faded quilt. Curiosity got the better of her. Kneeling down, she lifted the trunk's lid. Inside was a collection of memorabilia photos, letters and documents. One photo showed a young Henry alongside a woman she recognized as Eleanor. They looked blissful arms wrapped around each other, standing in front of the newly painted farmhouse. A pang of sympathy twisted in Charlotte's chest. If fate had been kinder, that happiness might still light every corner of Henry's life. She placed the photo aside and continued digging. Beneath more letters, her fingers brushed something metallic, a small locked tin box. It rattled slightly when she picked it up. Heart pounding with a mixture of hesitation and intrigue, she looked around the shed. A broken file lay nearby, and a moment of impulsiveness led her to pry open the box. Inside, she discovered a stack of folded documents and a worn black-and-white photograph of a baby. She unwrapped the documents. At first glance, they appeared to be hospital records or perhaps official certificates. One sheet read, "Certificate of Live Birth. Margaret Hope McCullen. Mother Eleanor R. McCullen, née Farnsworth. Father Henry J. McCullen." The date indicated the birth occurred about 4 years ago, well before Eleanor's death, but after Henry had married her. Charlotte's eyes widened. A child. She'd never seen a child on the ranch. Had she passed away, young Charlotte's heart squeezed at the thought. Further examination revealed more troubling details. A death certificate with the same name dated less than a year after the baby's birth. The cause complications from pneumonia. Charlotte felt tears prick at her eyes. So Henry and Eleanor had a daughter, a little girl who died before she could even grow up. This explained the profound shadows behind Henry's gaze, why the ranch felt permeated by grief beyond Eleanor's passing. Startled by a sudden noise at the shed's entrance, Charlotte looked up. There stood Henry Dust from the road, still clinging to his coat. His expression hardened when he saw the open trunk and the documents in Charlotte's trembling hands. "What are you doing?" His voice was hoarse, a mix of hurt and anger. Charlotte froze, guilt flushing her cheeks. I was cleaning and found these. Henry, I'm sorry. I didn't mean." He snatched the papers from her grasp, eyes flicking over them. The raw pain on his face made Charlotte's chest tighten. No one was supposed to see these. His voice cracked. Margaret was ours. She didn't survive her first winter. And then Eleanor, she never recovered from the loss. I lost them both. Tears welled up in Charlotte's eyes. She reached out to him instinctively, but Henry jerked away, knuckles white against the documents in his hand. "You had no right to pry," he said, though his voice shook more from anguish than anger. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Henry, you've carried this alone for so long. It's not my place, but—" He shook his head, eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Just leave me be." With that, he turned and stormed out of the shed, leaving Charlotte reeling from the discovery. She slumped to the ground, burying her face in her hands. She had unintentionally breached Henry's most intimate pain, something he clearly wanted locked away. When she finally gathered the courage to leave the shed, she found Henry in the barn brushing Rosie. His posture was rigid, every movement mechanical. She approached cautiously, her voice low. "Henry, I didn't mean to." He refused to meet her eyes. "I lost the loan," he muttered. "Banker turned me away. Said my equity wasn't enough." He paused, biting down on a wave of frustration. "So now we're stuck, and I come home to find you digging into my past." Charlotte placed a trembling hand on his arm, but he flinched, stepping back. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I only want to help." For a moment it looked like he might relent, that he might let down his guard and share this long-buried grief. But he simply set down the brush, walked out of the barn, and headed for the house with shoulders hunched. The documents still clutched in his fist. The unspoken words that lingered between them were thicker than any storm cloud that had darkened Sunset Bluff. The following week was tense at Sunset Bluff. Henry kept his distance, throwing himself into grueling ranch work from dawn until well after sunset. He barely spoke to Charlotte, unless absolutely necessary, and even Clive noticed the friction. Though he suspected some painful matter between them, Clive held his tongue, trusting they'd resolve it in their own time. Meanwhile, trouble brewed on multiple fronts. With the loan denied, Henry had to scramble for alternate solutions. He tried to negotiate with local buyers for the cattle, only to find Thomas G. Beric had beaten him there, driving down prices with his influence. It was a strategic move meant to isolate Henry financially, pushing him toward desperation. A rare bright spot came when Charlotte managed to finalize a deal with a traveling merchant from Kansas who agreed to buy a portion of the older horses at a fair price. It wasn't enough to save the ranch outright, but it kept them afloat for a while longer. Henry offered a terse thanks when she told him the news, and Charlotte accepted it with a heavy heart. Each night she retired to her room, replaying the shed incident in her mind. The image of the baby's photograph haunted her. She longed to comfort Henry, to share the load he carried, but his pain had built walls around him, and she couldn't find a way in. That changed when trouble showed up in the form of Beric's hired men. One afternoon, Charlotte was picking vegetables in her newly revitalized garden when she heard gunshots echo through the fields. Heart pounding, she dropped her basket and ran toward the noise. Clive, rifle in hand, stood near a fence line that separated Sunset Bluff from the neighboring property. Two of Beric's henchmen, tall, lanky figures draped in leather dusters, were on horseback brandishing revolvers. "Get off McCullen's land!" Clive bellowed, cocking his rifle. One of the men spat on the ground. "We're just scoping out the territory. Heard McCullen's cows have been wandering onto Beric's side." Clive's eyes narrowed. "Lies. Now get." Henry arrived on horseback, skidding to a halt beside Clive, his own revolver drawn. "This is private property," Henry growled, "and I won't tolerate trespassers." The lead henchman smirked. "You talk tough for a man up to his neck in debt." A tense standoff followed, broken only by the nervous shifting of the horses and Charlotte's quickening breath as she hid behind a wooden post. Finally, one of Beric's men feigned a yawn. "We'll be on our way," he said, turning his horse, "but we'll be back. Make sure your livestock stays off Beric's land, or there'll be consequences." The two rode away, leaving behind a smoldering sense of violation. Henry cursed under his breath. He and Clive exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Beric was escalating using intimidation tactics to push Henry toward surrender. That evening, the household gathered in the kitchen for a hastily prepared dinner. Tension thickened the air. Clive broke the silence. "We have to prepare for more trouble. Those men might come back armed. There's a real possibility we'll have to defend this place." Henry nodded solemnly. "We can't afford a prolonged fight. We only have a handful of guns and little ammunition." Charlotte listened, anxiety coiling in her stomach. She might have had little experience with firearms, but she wasn't afraid to learn. "Teach me to shoot," she said quietly, earning a surprised look from both men. "If I'm here, I want to help protect this ranch." Henry locked eyes with her, conflict flickering in his gaze. "Charlotte." She squared her shoulders. "I'm not a fragile flower, Henry. I was auctioned off once. I won't be a victim again." For a moment, Henry's stern facade cracked, and something akin to respect shone through. He nodded once. "All right. Tomorrow." After that, the household rallied together with newfound resolve. Clive set up target practice near the barn, demonstrating how to hold a rifle properly. Charlotte proved a quick study, her steady hands honed from a lifetime of hard work. Henry watched from a distance, arms folded, recalling the day Eleanor used to tease him for being too cautious. He realized Charlotte's grit was reminiscent of the same tenacity that once drew him to Eleanor. When dusk came, they were all exhausted. Henry lingered in the barn after everyone else had gone inside. The shadows grew long, and the distant hoot of an owl broke the silence. That was when Charlotte approached, her face illuminated by a dim lantern she carried. "Thank you," she said simply, "for letting me learn to shoot." Henry set down the feed bucket he'd been carrying. "You did well." "Surprised me." His voice held a trace of admiration. They stood there, the barn's lantern, casting dancing light against rough wooden walls. Charlotte took a shaky breath. "Henry, about what I found in the shed." His jaw tightened. "We don't have to talk about it. I know. But I want you to know you're not alone. If you ever need to." He inhaled sharply, cutting her off. "Losing Margaret nearly broke Eleanor. And losing Eleanor nearly broke me. That's all there is to it." Charlotte's eyes shone with empathy. "I'm sorry you had to go through that alone." Henry swallowed hard, guilt and longing mingling in his expression. He reached out and gently touched Charlotte's shoulder, an unspoken gesture of both apology and gratitude. Then he turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving her bathed in the glow of the lantern, his warmth still lingering where his hand had touched her. Outside, the night sky shimmered with stars, as if offering a glimmer of hope. But both Henry and Charlotte knew that before they could find any measure of peace, they'd have to stand their ground against Beric. And perhaps in standing together, they might finally confront the ghosts that loomed over Sunset Bluff. Trouble came faster than expected. Within days, rumors spread through Lone Pine that Beric's men had been spotted riding the perimeter of Sunset Bluff, scouting out vulnerabilities. Clive took to patrolling at dawn and dusk, rifle at the ready. Henry spent sleepless nights poring over the ranch's finances, searching for a miracle that might free them from Beric's clutches. Charlotte helped where she could, balancing the books, tending the garden, and cleaning rifles that Clive and Henry had laid out on the kitchen table. She was determined not to be a bystander again. They had become an unlikely family, each person indispensable, each defending the ranch for reasons that went beyond mere ownership. For Charlotte, it was about forging a place to belong. The confrontation arrived one sweltering afternoon. Charlotte was in the garden, her hair tied back, sweat beading on her forehead. The sun beat mercilessly, making the air heavy with heat. She squinted across the field and saw dust-rising horses galloping at full speed. Instinct jolted her. Beric's men were coming. She dropped her tools and ran for the house to sound the alarm. Within moments, Henry, Clive, and Charlotte took positions. Clive crouched behind a fence post with his rifle. Henry stationed himself on the porch, shotgun in hand. Charlotte peered nervously from a window, her heart racing, but her grip steady on the revolver Henry had given her. 7 riders approached, led by Beric himself. He reined in his horse, regarding the scene with a smug curl of his lip. His henchmen fanned out behind him. Mr. McCullen Beric called out, "We've come to finalize our business." Henry's voice cut through the hot air. "There is no business. Ride away." Beric's grin hardened. "I've purchased your outstanding debts from the banker. You owe me now. And I know for a fact you don't have the funds to settle." A murmur of unease passed through Henry and Clive. If Beric truly held their debt, it meant he had legal leverage. "I'll pay back every cent, just not on your timetable," Henry said. But the edges of his voice wavered with uncertainty. Beric motioned one of his men forward. "Look around, Henry. This ranch is barely standing. You're out of options. I'm prepared to let you keep working here under me if you sign over the deed." Henry's temper flared, heat rising to his cheeks. "I'd burn this place to the ground before letting you take it." Beric's cold eyes flicked to Charlotte, who stood at the window, with her revolver visible. He let out a low chuckle. "You've recruited quite the little army. But let's be honest, a rancher with no money and a bondsome servant girl aren't much of a threat." Clive had heard enough. He fired a warning shot into the air, making Beric's men startle. "You're on private land, fellas. Best ride off before we fill you with lead." Beric's tone shifted his civility, draining away. "Have it your way." He drew his revolver and fired a shot that splintered the railing near Henry's feet. Chaos erupted. Clive returned fire, forcing Beric's men to scatter. Henry ducked behind a barrel on the porch, pumping his shotgun to keep the intruders at bay. Charlotte's hands shook, but she steeled herself. She aimed at one of the riders circling around the barn, pulling the trigger. The bullet grazed the rider's arm, causing him to yelp and wheel away. Her ears rang from the gun's discharge, adrenaline surging through her veins. Dust and gunshots filled the air as the ranch became a battleground. Beric's men tried to flank from both sides, but Henry and Clive were seasoned shooters, and Charlotte's newly acquired skills made her a fierce surprise. She reloaded quickly, remembering Clive's lessons, pressing her back against the window frame for cover. Beric took a moment to reload his revolver behind a stack of crates, cursing under his breath. His plan to intimidate Henry into submission was failing undone by the rancher's refusal to yield. A bullet from Henry's shotgun whistled past Beric's head, shattering the crates into splinters. Enraged Beric mounted his horse, signaling a retreat. "Fall back," he shouted to his men. "We'll settle this another way." They galloped off, leaving behind 2 men who were too wounded to ride. One clutched his bleeding arm, the other limped, trying to hobble away. Henry lowered his shotgun, breathing heavily. His eyes flicked to Clive, who had taken a grazing shot to the shoulder, but was still standing. Charlotte burst out of the house, tears of relief mixing with sweat. She rushed to Clive, helping him stay upright. The once quiet homestead was now littered with smoking shell casings and churned up earth. 2 of Beric's men lay groaning near the barn, and Henry moved to disarm them. Charlotte's hands still trembled, but she forced herself to check their wounds, ripping strips from her apron to make rudimentary bandages. She might despise what these men stood for, but she wouldn't let anyone bleed out if she could help it. Henry's gaze swept across the ranch. Fence posts were shot to pieces, windows shattered, but the main house still stood. Sunset Bluff had survived for now. But Beric's final words rang in his ears. "We'll settle this another way." They all knew Beric wasn't finished. He'd regroup, use the law, or his wealth, or both, to crush them. But as Charlotte met Henry's eyes across the chaos, each saw a fire in the other that hadn't been there before. Henry might have lost so much in his life, but he was done giving up. And Charlotte, once abandoned and sold, was finished being helpless. A faint smile flickered between them, grim but resolute. In that fleeting moment, it became clear that even if they faced bigger storms ahead, they would stand together. Beric could threaten their land, their safety, but he couldn't break the grit and heart that had taken root in the battered soil of Sunset Bluff. In the days following the shootout, Sunset Bluff lay in uneasy calm. Clive's wound wasn't dire, but he needed rest. Charlotte helped him change bandages and prepared homemade poultices. Henry secured the property as best he could, installing new locks, boarding up broken windows, and repairing fences. Despite the lingering threat of Beric's return, a sense of unity blossomed. Henry no longer carried his secrets alone. He didn't speak much about Margaret or Eleanor, but he no longer bristled when Charlotte gently ventured into memories. Once she found him gazing at Eleanor's portrait. He gave a small nod when she approached, allowing her presence where he once insisted on solitude. It was a silent acknowledgement that he no longer wanted to be entirely alone with his grief. News traveled fast in Lone Pine. Some folks sided with Beric, others with Henry. But the tide of public opinion took a surprising turn when Martha Leland started sharing the story of how Beric's men shot first, threatening a local rancher on his own land. Marshal Bill Tilghman, a real-life lawman with a growing reputation, heard the rumors. He rode out to Sunset Bluff to take statements from Henry, Charlotte, and Clive. After hearing their account and seeing the bullet-riddled fences, Tilghman made it clear he wouldn't allow vigilantism in his territory. This pushback from a respected lawman put Beric on notice, yet the land baron still tried to corner Henry through the debt he had purchased. Legal documents began arriving, demanding immediate repayment. Each envelope felt like a ticking time bomb. Charlotte's quick arithmetic showed that even with their best efforts, they'd be short. Then came an unexpected ally. A traveling cattle buyer who'd heard of Charlotte's negotiation skills reached out, offering a higher-than-average price for several of Henry's top steers. It was risky selling off prized livestock, could hamper the ranch's long-term plans. But it might also provide just enough cash to settle with Beric and free them from his grip. Henry agonized over the decision. One evening he and Charlotte sat in the main room, the crackling firelight casting their shadows across the walls. If we sell those steers, we're losing strong breeding stock. It sets us back, he said, running a hand over his tired face. Charlotte understood the stakes. But it also cuts Beric's leverage, she replied gently. We can rebuild Henry as long as this ranch remains ours. He studied her, realizing just how far they'd come from the moment he spotted her on that auction block to this intimate conference by firelight. We'll do it, he finally said, exhaling. It might be the only chance we have. In a whirlwind of activity, the buyer arrived, inspected the cattle, and wrote a bank draft large enough to clear Beric's debt. Henry, still uneasy, rode into Lone Pine and paid off every cent. Beric was there, lurking in the banker's office. The land baron's rage flared when he realized his gambit had failed. Henry met Beric's glare with quiet triumph, pocketing the final receipt that proved Sunset Bluff was free and clear. Returning home late, Henry found Charlotte waiting on the porch lantern, in hand her eyes shining with anticipation. He stepped off his horse, brandishing the receipt. She let out a little laugh of relief. Impulsively, Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. For a long moment, they just stood there, under the vast, starlit sky, the burdens of doubt and fear momentarily lifted. After that day, the ranch began to mend. Fences were reinforced, outbuildings repaired, and a new sense of optimism spread like wildfire. Clive recovered well enough to resume daily duties, grumbling only mildly about the bullet wound. Charlotte expanded the garden, planting rows of squash beans and herbs. One afternoon, she even placed a small bouquet on the mantel beneath Eleanor's portrait, a symbol of fresh starts coexisting with cherished memories. Henry soon approached Charlotte with a proposition. I want you to stay free of any indenture, he said, handing her the official documents that nullified the auction contract. You've more than earned it. Charlotte's eyes welled with tears. Though she'd long accepted her peculiar status, the symbolic gesture meant everything. "I'd like to stay," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "But as an equal, not a servant." Henry smiled, the lines of sorrow on his face softened by genuine warmth. As an equal, he echoed. They never held a grand wedding. Life on the frontier didn't always allow for such luxuries, but quietly in the presence of a circuit-riding preacher, and Clive as a witness, Henry and Charlotte pledged to stand by each other. The house once saturated with the echoing silence of grief, slowly filled with the warmth of conversation, the clink of dishes at mealtime, and the prospect of a shared future. On the day Charlotte found out she was expecting their first child, she sat with Henry at the edge of a small pond on the property. They let the news settle between them, tears of joy mingling with the memory of what Henry had lost before. Charlotte laced her fingers with his. "This house, this land. It's our home now," she said, her voice catching. "We'll fill it with laughter." Henry kissed her palm gently, hope shining in his grey eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in tomorrow without the weight of yesterday's sorrow crushing him. And indeed, Sunset Bluff seemed to glow with new life, a testament to the healing power of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond they had forged when a lonely widower bid on an abandoned woman at a dusty auction yard, never expecting she'd become his greatest redemption. Life can take the most unlikely twists, like a widowed rancher raising his hand at a frontier auction to save a stranger and ending up saving himself in the process. Henry McCullen and Charlotte Dawson remind us that from the ashes of heartbreak can rise a new kind of family, built on shared trials and tender hopes. They defended Sunset Bluff not just from scheming land barons, but from the haunting grief that nearly swallowed them both. In building a home together, they discovered that love's power far outstrips any darkness the wild frontier can throw at you. Thank you for joining us on this journey through dusty plains, fierce storms, and the indomitable spirit of the American West. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps the tales of courage, resilience, and hope alive for everyone who dares to dream of a better tomorrow.